Today we're going to talk about the muscular system. I wanted to talk about the nervous system before the muscular system because I really felt that there was a significant interaction between these two systems, and I thought it would be easier to understand this unit after going over the neurologic system. And so even though in your book this is module 5 and the nervous system is module 7, I decided it would be best to start with this system, with the nervous system, and follow it with this system. The second point I'll make is this module is primarily about how muscles work, and that's what I'm going to focus on. And I am not going to do the module 6, which goes over the various names of various muscles. And I've just made that decision because I think, again, it's more important to know how muscles work and what they do than to know each individual muscle's name. That being said, let's get started by discussing the functions of the muscle system or muscular system. The first of those functions I think is obvious to everybody, and that is that they are responsible for allowing us to move. Another function that many people are not aware of is the fact that they also help keep us upright and allow us to have a posture without very much thinking about keeping our head straight in front of us and sitting up straight and these sorts of things. The muscle system, by its natural function, keeps our posture in order. And then thirdly, and least obvious, but once you think about it, it makes sense, the muscle system is the principal way in which the body produces heat. And in the process of movement, heat is produced, and when we rest, heat is lost. And that's why when we have a fever or when we need to generate heat, we begin to shiver. And that contraction of muscles generates heat and helps warm the body up. Now, there are really 3 types of muscles that we need to consider. The first of these is called the skeletal muscle. It's also called the striated muscle. These are the voluntary muscles that can be consciously controlled, and they consist of multinucleated cells. In this diagram, the middle section is the skeletal muscle, and you'll notice the stripes that are present in those muscle cells. And each muscle cell has more than one nucleus. Now, these muscles are under voluntary control, but some of them are sort of semi-voluntary. That is to say, you can voluntarily stop them from contracting or make them contract more vigorously, but also they will contract on their own without conscious thought. And one of the examples of that is the diaphragm, which you do not have to think about breathing in order to breathe, but you have the conscious ability to either pant or hold your breath if the need arises. The second is shown on the right here, is called a smooth muscle. These do not have the same stripes that are seen in the skeletal muscle and therefore are called non-striated. These are involuntary, meaning they are not under conscious control, and each individual cell has but one nucleus. The third is a specialized involuntary muscle known as the cardiac muscle. It's striated, so it is different from the smooth muscle in that regard. It has one nucleus and is involuntary. It also branches, which is different than the smooth muscle or non-striated muscle. So these are the 3 types of muscles: the skeletal muscle or voluntary muscle, the smooth muscle or involuntary muscle, and the cardiac muscle, which is the specialized version of involuntary muscle. Now, muscles have certain properties that are important for their function. The first of these is sort of obvious, that is that they contract, and it's shown at the top here, and that just means that the cells can shorten forcefully, and so that they can pull together or generate a force in which they become shorter than their original length. The second is related to the first in that one is required for the other to occur, and that's called excitability. Excitability means that the muscle cells can respond to an outside stimulus, and that response is what's known as an action potential, which we talked about in detail in the last set of videos. The third is that muscle cells are also extensible, which means that they can be passively stretched beyond their natural length. Extensibility is important in increasing the ability of the muscles to do various jobs. And then lastly, they're elastic. And elasticity means that when stretched or contracted, the muscle will naturally return or snap back to its original resting length. And that's what's meant by elasticity. Now here's a diagram, and I'm going to approach this diagram in many ways the same way I approached the diagrams in our previous lecture. We'll start out by pointing out various parts of the structure, and then we'll go through it again, describing what each of these parts does. So in this structure, first of all, you have a bone, which the muscle is attached to. The muscle is attached to that bone by this structure right here, which is known as a tendon. A tendon is a connective tissue structure that attaches muscle tissue to bone, and that's its definition. Remember that the outside of the nerve was called the epineurium. Well, the outside of the muscle is called the epimysium. The inside or bundle of muscle fibers is surrounded by an outside covering known as the perimysium. Remember, the same bundle of neurons or axons was covered by the perineurium. The inside these is the individual muscle fibers, which are also individual muscle cells. So these are surrounded by a covering known as the endomysium. Remember that each axon is covered by the endoneurium. And then within that is the individual fibers of muscles known as the myofibril. Now that's a part of the muscle cell and not the entire muscle cell. The muscle cell itself is called a muscle fiber or a muscle cell. And then just like with the nerves, the bundles of these muscle fibers are called fascicles. So the outside of the muscle is covered by the epimysium, just like the outside of the nerve is called the epineurium. The fascicles are bundles of muscle fibers, just like a fascicle is a bundle of axons. This is covered by a membrane known as a perimysium, just like the fascicles of nerves are covered by the perineurium. And then each individual muscle fiber is covered by the endomysium, just like each individual axon is covered by the endoneurium. And so there's a direct correlation between these names that helps us remember them. And then lastly, the inside of each muscle fiber has individual fibrils known as myofibrils. The fascicle is a bundle of muscle fibers or muscle cells. And in this drawing, you can see the circle surrounds a bundle of muscle cells. Each muscle cell can be identified by the fact that you see the nucleus in each one of those. The endomysium is the collagen covering for each muscle cell. And the perimysium is the covering that wraps around each fascicle. And that's shown with this arrow right here. The epimysium is the covering around a bundle or several fascicles. And that's shown here. Now here's a closer look at a single muscle cell to point out a few of the structures within one single muscle cell. The sarcolemma is the plasma membrane of the muscle cell. Sarco comes from the Greek word sarx, which means flesh. And so the plasma membrane around the fleshy aspect of a muscle cell would be called the sarcolemma. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is that part shown in blue here that is the endoplasmic reticulum of the muscle cell, and its important characteristic is the fact that it has a lot of calcium within it. You also see that there are a lot of mitochondria within a muscle cell because there's a lot of necessary energy involved in muscle contraction. T-tubules, which are pointed out here in yellow, are small extensions of the sarcolemma into the interior of the cell to the endosarcoplasmic reticulum. And what this does is it allows for the action potential, which comes along the surface of the cell, to penetrate deep into the interior of the cell and cause reactions in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now, muscle contraction occurs in a model known as the sliding filament model. And this is an explanation for how muscles contract with one set of myofibrils sliding over the other. And we will go over this in detail in the next several slides. The sarcomere is a repeating unit of a myofibril, and each of these, the top and the bottom, one is relaxed and one is contracted, represents one sarcomere. Here's another diagram showing a single sarcomere in the expanded version or relaxed version, and then the contracted version. And the point of this slide is to show that this is made up of two sets of filaments. The thin filaments, labeled actin in the diagram, are called actin myofilaments, which are filaments that interact with the myosin. The myosin myofilaments are thick filaments that interact with the actin. Now, when the sliding occurs, the actin filaments slide across the myosin filaments. The myosin filaments do not change in length during a contraction, and that's important to remember. Now, when these interactions occur, there's a formation of a cross bridge, which happens when the head of the myosin molecule attaches itself to the actin molecule. And this is why the myosin molecules in this diagram look like little arrowheads, one right after another. Each of those is supposed to represent a myosin head, protein head, which interacts with the actin in order to initiate contraction. I'm going to use this diagram to show particular zones in the sarcomere. The first of these zones is known as the A band. If you look across the top, you'll see the A band is labeled in the middle and represents the width of the myosin thick filaments. It's a dark stripe, and it contains both myosin and actin, although if you look, it goes from the end of one myosin thick filament to its other end. The second of these bands is the I band. The I band is the thinner band that's on the outside of the A band on either side and represents the area where only actin can be seen. The Z line is the protein that serves as the anchor for the actin between one sarcomere and another sarcomere. And you can see the Z line both on the left and the right at the bottom of the diagram at either end of the sarcomere. And this is the area where one sarcomere is attached to another so that when a contraction occurs, the entire muscle contracts. The last of these zones that I want to point out is called the H zone. The H zone, in the middle on the bottom where the label is where there is only myosin thick filament and no actin thick filament. At this point, I'm going to wrap up this portion, and when we go to the next part, we'll go into more detail regarding muscle contraction.